Gloria, we promise you we will leave this living room the way we found it. You'll have no cleaning up to do. I guarantee it. Jacques d'Amboise, who was to be here today, could not come because his health has prevented him from doing it. But I wanted to read a little bit of a story before we hear from Pat, because so many people sent messages just like the one from Bono. And this one, I think, coming off of some of the great stories that Gloria told, will resonate with a lot of you. This is from George Benford, who wrote so many science fiction novels, and Marvin is mentioned in the acknowledgments of so many of Benford's books. He wrote this, and it's called The Minsky-Coleman Worst Driver Study. I shall always remember, both as a physicist and as a writer, Marvin's trenchant comments on a novel of mine. Quote, "Thank you for sending me a copy of your book. I'll waste no time reading it." It works. But there is new science to be revealed, even as we remember him here. Neither Marvin nor another old friend, Sidney Coleman, Harvard particle physicist, knew that a small coterie of their friends carried out experiments to measure precisely the worst Bostonian driver index for these extraordinary characters. Our carefully considered observations occurred on the streets of Cambridge and Boston. A typical incident begins with swerves and narrowly averted scrapes, sometimes yielding curb-jumping forays into parks, alleyways, soccer fields, and the odd laundromat. Friends and horrified passengers alike had long noted the distracted trajectories of Marvin-piloted cars down through the collisional decades. Our initial intent as physicists and mathematicians was to measure the stochastic component of the many dented and damaged vehicles in which Marvin carried us, usually to dinner. While beguiled by his transcendent rolling sentences rich in ideas, we noted pale, frightened faces pressed to the windows of nearby cars, squealing brakes, angry shouts, and blaring horns. And here was the clue. Those horn signals gave us our method: acoustic measurements of the horn amplitude while weaving down, say, Massachusetts Avenue, as we from the South term it, clearly established the unique turbulence attendant to a Minsky outing. Independent observers, among whom I am proud to number myself, soon established that the noted theorist Sidney Coleman also had a comparable horn blare index, with perhaps a trifle more of the delightful Cambridge obscene shouts hurled into the mix as well. Our thoughts turned to experiment. Assemble a few couples, so 2 cars are needed to get to the Valhalla of the evening's favored restaurant. Thus, Minsky and Coleman would be on the same road at the same time and could be independently evaluated. Did the horn blare index increase merely linearly, a simple sum, or was there a collective effect the world of physics yearned to know? These decisive experiments involved much fender-bender damage through several years, adjusting for climate, inebriation, and general hilarity, of course. The results were decisive. A coherent effect. The Minsky-Coleman horn blare index scaled as the square of the sum. Subsequent publication in the Journal of Irreproducible Results brought nods of wry acknowledgement. Those of us who knew both these grand figures now regret their absence, for further experiments are impossible, unless, of course, there is a heaven with, alas, Bostonian traffic. Purgatory, perhaps. And perhaps Marvin is swerving and weaving still somewhere. Patrick.
Well, John, thank you for the clarification. I am Patrick Henry Winston. I'm certain of it, even though the program is a little bit confused. I was talking with Doug Gregan yesterday, and he took me to Marvin's homepage and showed me the list of 75 students. I'm sure it's a subset. I'm sure it's not complete. And Doug pointed out that you could populate, and it's true that many prominent places have been populated by those 75. When I first thought about what I might talk about today, I thought, well, I'll talk about Marvin's intellectual legacy, but Then it occurred to me I would need 5 hours, not just 5 minutes to do that. So I decided instead to tell you a little bit about what it was like to be among those 75. It's an intensely personal story, but I think it's a story that's not unlike the story that would be told by many of the others. And it's also a story about how a very small number of words from someone like Marvin can have a huge influence on somebody's life. It all started when I was a graduate student, but didn't know why. I hadn't really any clue about what I wanted to do, and my father was beginning to talk darkly about law school. And I was fortunate enough at that time to have a friend of mine suggest that I go with him to a class he was taking on artificial intelligence. And so I did. I went to that class, and I was, of course, mesmerized. And at the end of the class, when we were walking out, I said to my friend, I want to do what he does. It was an epiphanous moment. I didn't quite know what to do about it, though, so I thought, well, I guess the first step should be that I'll take this course. And I did, and I tried to be as conspicuous as possible. I sat in the front row, right in the center. I nodded frequently. Every once in a while, I would timidly ask a question, but I couldn't seem to get any traction no matter what I did. Marvin didn't notice me. So beginning to get more and more worried about what was going on. The end of the semester approached, and I was apprehensive about how my term paper would be received. And I got it back, and there it was, a grade and only one comment. Would you like a summer job in the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory? It took about a nanosecond to make that decision, and I soon found myself not only being a graduate student in the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory and partaking of the wonderful environment, the magical environment that had been produced by Marvin and Richard Greenblatt, Tom Knight, Russell Nofsker. It was a magical time. People in the other Cambridge wanted to be in this Cambridge. People in this Cambridge wanted to be in the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. People in the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory were there all night. It was a very bonding and amazing experience. And eventually I wrote a thesis proposal, and the subject I proposed to study was how a program might build descriptions of structures in the blocks world. And there was a footnote in the thesis proposal that muttered something about how those structural descriptions might make it possible to learn something. It was a footnote. And Marvin didn't say much about the proposal, but indicated I should go ahead. So go ahead I did, and I like everyone else, worked all night, worked all day, had a lot of fun doing it. But I didn't have much actual direct interaction with Marvin. And the reason was I was frightened of him. He was so smart. It was scary. And if you are a little bit shy like I was, it was difficult to strike up a conversation. He had a short attention span. It was unreasonable, of course. It was unnatural because Marvin was not just a genius. He was a kind genius, and he was a fun genius, and he had a lot of those kinds of properties that should have made me at ease, but I was not. But nevertheless, time went on, and I reached a point where I thought I might have something that Marvin could close his eyes and sign as my thesis supervisor. And so I put a copy of a draft on his desk, and he lost it. And I put another copy on his desk, and he lost that too. And this was not good because in those days, your thesis was printed out on a Model 32 teletype. And the Model 32 teletype, if you've ever worked with it, has a tendency to jam. So it took several hours to print out a copy of my thesis. So I hit on the idea that the next time, I think it was the third or fourth copy I printed out, I would attach to a brick. So he couldn't lose it. In fact, I have here the very brick, in case you think I'm kidding. And of course, it had a label attached to it, frontispiece and retrieval aid for Winston's thesis. Evidently, Marvin got a kick out of it because he did read it at that point. And Margaret Minsky read it too. She can spell and I can't, so when it came back, it had a lot of comments from Marvin on the content and from a lot of harsh criticism from Margaret about the spelling. But alas, I couldn't quite tell from the comments if he liked it or not. But it seemed like the natural thing to do was to proceed with some kind of thesis defense. So this was what I thought was going to be my last term as a graduate student, a PhD student. And I began to think, well, maybe I should think about a job. And my father thought I should think about a job too. He kept saying, what exactly are you going to do when you get your diploma? And I ultimately said, well, in the long run, I have no idea. But in the short run, on the very day it happens, I think I'll drink a lot. So the appointed day arrived, and I presented myself for my thesis defense. And in those days, things were rather informal. My thesis defense seemed to be consisting of having lunch with Marvin and Seymour. And they talked a little bit about my thesis, asked me a question, but mostly they talked about other stuff. So I thought, well, this isn't going very well. And as the end of the lunch approached, somewhat to my relief, Marvin then said, oh, by the way, would you like to be on the faculty here? Well, this must have been the second most thrilling moment of my life, with that comment on my term paper being the third most thrilling moment of my life. But this was the second most thrilling moment of my life, and of course it made it possible for me to interact with Marvin over the next several decades, to be his friend, his colleague, and admirer. And during that time, I sometimes thought, what will people say about all this 1,000 years from now? And I soon concluded what they would say is that Alan Turing told us that we could make computers intelligent, and Marvin told us how to do it. And he told us how to do it from 1961 on. In 1961, we had the paper Steps Toward Artificial Intelligence, and it was a grand recipe for what we should do for the next 20 or 30 years. And then before that, as Daniela said, we had the Computation of Infinite Machines, and we soon after that had the Perceptron book. And then we had the Frames paper, which is full of ideas that I use every day. And then we have the K-line paper. One of the things I find most intriguing about Marvin's work is the statement that what we do when we think is we put ourselves back in the partial mental state we were in before when we thought about a similar problem. And then we have The Society of Mind and the Emotion Machine. Fabulous books that will keep us busy for decades to come because they're like diamond mines. They're full of ideas, some of them rough, some of them needing polishing and cutting, but all of them stimulating and provocative, and they're ready for us to mine and polish and make into gems. If I were forced to summarize those books in a single word, I'd say they're about multiplicities, because Marvin always said that there's no one way to do anything. We need many ways of reasoning. We need multiple levels of thinking. We need lots of representations. So that theme of multiplicities runs through both of those books and all of his work. Another thing that I would hasten to add about those books is that Marvin was always talking about what he called suitcase words. He believed that words like intelligence, consciousness, emotion, these are all labels for concepts that are so big they're like giant suitcases you can stuff anything into. And that's, I think, an extraordinarily good way of thinking about intelligence and creativity and emotion. Because it says to me that when someone says, is Deep Blue intelligent? Is the Washington Jeopardy playing program intelligent? Is AlphaGo intelligent? The immediate answer is yes. They have a kind of intelligence. But there are lots of kinds. And having worked those things out, we have not yet finished the job. So that's something about the legacy. But there's another kind of legacy, too. And for that, I have to take you back to the list of 75. And not just the list of 75, but everybody who interacted with Marvin. It was my experience that being a graduate student, the first thing that I started thinking about when I came into the laboratory is, well, thoughts kept coming to my mind, such as, what did Marvin mean by that? And then after a while, I found myself in conversation with other students, and we would say, what would Marvin think about this? And then after a while, we would all absorb the biases and the stories and the ways of thinking and the insights, and we would just start thinking like Marvin thought. And I suppose I flatter myself to think that I think like Marvin thinks, but I'm sure that at least in a small measure it must be true. And the reason I think so is that a few years ago, Marvin and I were over at BU at a celebration of Alan Turing's 100th birthday. And Marvin gave a talk, and then I gave a talk. I spoke about my work on story understanding and my reasons for believing that story understanding, our story competence, is the defining characteristic of human intelligence. I talked about how it related to what Marvin was thinking. And after that talk, I didn't really know if it was successful or not, because in the end there was a room full of people, but I was only speaking to one. And not much happened there for a while, but some time later, I had Marvin in to talk to my students. I teach the undergraduate artificial intelligence subject here at MIT, and it's a big class. It's taught over in room 10250 under the Great Dome. It's MIT's largest and best lecture hall. And I always like to have Marvin come in because I wanted my students to see Marvin, listen to him, see how he thought. And the last time Marvin came in, I decided I would tell the story about the first time I heard Marvin speak. And I told the story about that day when my friend took me that lecture, and I left saying to him, I want to do what he does. And I told the story, and then I handed the floor to Marvin, and then I sat down. And then Marvin started to speak, and he said, we've come full circle. I want to do what you do. And that was the most thrilling moment of my life.
Oh, I'm a very notorious Japanese Yoshiaki Shirai. Oh, I didn't expect this kind of celebration, because in Japan we have a similar ceremony, but at that time some people may cry, but no one laughs like this. So let me talk about Japanese style, okay? So, yes, the Minsky has been my teacher and friend for more than 40 years. Okay? I met him in 1971 when I stayed at his laboratory 1 year. But before that, I read some articles of his articles. For example, the paper, Steps Toward Artificial Intelligence. That Minsky told me after he wrote that paper, the best people in the world gathered to his laboratory. And also I read when I was working on robot vision at the electrotechnical laboratory, I read the progress report, and he pointed out that most computer vision often make mistakes. The conventional computer vision program has a fault, that is, it has a hierarchical structure, like this. Right? So, in hierarchical structure, first features are extracted, then it is organized as a kind of line drawing, and then finally interpreted as three-dimensional object. So, if the lower level makes error, it propagates to upper levels and never corrected. So, this is the starting point of my research life. So, based on this lesson, while I was staying at his laboratory, I tried to recognize blocks using heteroarchical method. Right? When work finished, I showed the result to Patrick Winston. He suddenly understood the situation as usual and called Minsky. And looking at my demonstration, Minsky was very glad. And on the spot, he invited me to his house. Not like that, but and where I met Gloria and 3 children. And I remember very pleasant evening with them. Later, he was invited to Japan many times to give lectures and talks. Among them, the Japan award ceremony might be unique. Japan Award is a kind of Nobel Prize in Japan. And you can see the Gloria and Minsky. Okay? Yes, Marvin. And I was one of about 30 members of the selection committee. After Minsky was selected as a winner, I was appointed to support the ceremony and plan related events. Maybe in the back you may find me. Okay. So during while Marvin and Gloria are visiting Japan, we attended many events, including a banquet with the emperor and empress. This may be the last visit of Minsky in Kyoto, and it's arranged by Takebayashi. Now he is sitting around there today. So this is the last visit to Cambridge together. So once Minsky and I talked about AI and agreed that there is not a law that governs AI. Minsky said, AI is complex and constitutes of many micro-theories. So I am sure that he must be very happy to find the AI and challenge the difficult and attractive target. Thank Marvin and you.
Yes, there are people who need a vacation. I've never felt the need for a vacation because everything is different every minute. I've had that feeling called happy, but I find it's really creepy.
What's really creepy?
The worst thing is being happy. You have to shake it off quickly, or you might get addicted.
I have no explanation for that picture. Apparently things happen at the little conference that I run that I should probably disavow, but I don't know why he chose the color of the hat. Lose the picture, please, and put up something more. Not that one. Save that for the end. The regular picture that used to be there. There we go. I'm Michael Hawley. Marvin was my advisor, my mentor, friend, kind of my other father, and my landlord, incidentally. I lived in that house. It wasn't nearly as neat and tidy when I was there. When I was there, it was sort of like FAO Schwartz after the bomb had gone off. But in a nice way. There was always things to play with. I was thinking in the shower the other day, where I do all of my valuable thinking, as we all do, that there are some people who know a little about a lot, and other people who know a lot about a little. And which is better? Would you rather be one or the other? I think it depends to some extent on how old you are. But a lot of folks wind up knowing a lot about a little. You know, they become professors. They become professionals. They become specialists. And there are other points on that continuum. There are plenty of people that don't know much about anything. And then there are people who know a lot about everything, and they delight in learning a lot about many things. And obviously Marvin was in that bucket. And I think there are certain characteristics that many of us knew and loved. You have to be open and receptive to all sorts of unexpected things. And so along those lines, I have just three little anecdotes and one story. The story is a significant one for me, since it was about the major turning point in my life. But little anecdotes. Just after Marvin passed away, I sent a note to a friend who knew Marvin as well. I didn't hear anything back for several weeks. Finally, I get a note, and he said, you know, I've never forgotten the evening that you and I went out to dinner with Marvin and Gloria and John Cage. He said John was a kind of unusual composer, to put it mildly. And he said, we were there with John, and he was prattling on about his wacky macrobiotic diet with this delightful twinkle in his eye. And then he shifted gears and began explaining his theory of interplanetary travel, which involved building a spaceship that would be a perfect sphere. And it was so perfect in its spherical shape that it would effortlessly float from one planet to the next. Isn't that wonderful, Cage said. And Olin said, you know, that was without question the most bizarre and unforgettable evening of my life. But the thing is, for Marvin, it was just Thursday. And in the course of being the graduate student in residence in the house, there was a constant parade of crazy people there. But when no one was around and I had to answer the phone, I'd pass the messages on to Marvin. Marvin, Gene Roddenberry called. He wants to talk to you about this data character. And Alvy Ray Smith is coming by. Umberto Eco wants to have dinner. Whatever. And I think that speaks to a person who knows how to welcome the unlikeliest experts. And that was a big lesson for me. It took a long time for it to sink in, but I learned a tremendous amount just sort of through the floorboards. Here's the story. I was 22 or 23 when I met Marvin. This was a little over 31, 32 years ago. And interestingly, he was probably the same age then that I am now, give or take a year. And I met him because of Margaret. Margaret had been a gadabout, hanging out at all the cool places in Silicon Valley. I, at the time, was working at Lucasfilm, hacking on digital movies with the team there. But I'd done it for 3 or 4 years, and I felt the urge to go to graduate school. I was angling that way. I thought that I should get back into real research and education and teaching and learning. And I figured, why mess around? Why don't I just take a look at every place? As an undergraduate, I'd never visited any schools at all. And I thought, this time I'm going to do what you're supposed to do. I'll go check them all out. And so I lined up a couple of speaking opportunities for myself. I was sort of a hotshot programmer from an interesting place, so there was a little demand. And I had a talk arranged at Princeton and one at Yale. And quickly the dance card filled up. There was Cornell and Caltech and Stanford and Berkeley and other places, University of Washington. I remember Cornell vividly, partly because I arrived in the middle of a blizzard and got snowed in an extra day and bluffed my way into the Carillon Tower and played the bells. Nice talk, met the computer graphics guys. But I also met Carl Sagan. And swoon. It's hard not to be thrilled by the idea of exploring beyond our planet. We're the first generation of humans to be able to do that. It's one of the most profound endeavors of all. And so I left Cornell with my head spinning, went down to San Diego and gave a talk there, and had a very fleeting encounter with Francis Crick, who was studying brains, but it was the first time I'd thought of biology in a way that just didn't have much to do with growing tomatoes. I mean, it was another field that was clearly going to unfold. And we would be the first generation of people to engineer new life forms. That seemed pretty interesting. I get back to Lucasfilm, my head was sort of spinning. And in the course of a couple of weeks, a whole assortment of folks kind of wafted through. Don Knuth and John Chowning from Stanford, I met lots of them. Richard Feynman came by. And at the time, I just hooked up a music synthesizer to my computer, one of the very first MIDI connections. And Feynman got the hugest kick out of it, because I had a little sequencer, and I used it to play bongo sequences. And next thing I knew, Feynman had dragged me down to Caltech, and he and Carver Mead were sort of persuasive, let's say. I was sorely tempted to go to Caltech. And then a week later, Mark had turned up with Marvin, and we all went out for Chinese food. And I was sitting next to Marvin. We talked about movies. Of course, movies were my job. We talked about music and movies. Marvin was a big fan of John Williams. And after rattling through all sorts of John Williams anecdotes, we sort of slid effortlessly into conversation about late Beethoven quartets. And at some point, I got up the nerve to ask Marvin where he went for his PhD. And he said, Princeton. And I said, oh, who was your advisor? And he said, Tucker, Albert Tucker. I said, I didn't know that. He said, well, in fact, he said, I probably did more work with John von Neumann. And so as I was picking my fork up off the floor, he continued and said, yeah, and I worked summers at Bell Laboratories with Claude Shannon. And I thought, head exploding. I blurted out, hey, I worked at Bell Labs too, but it didn't have the same resonance. And Marvin was saying something about a really exciting new laboratory at MIT. And I wasn't listening, because I'd already decided where I was going to go. And interestingly, MIT was the only place that I didn't visit. I went sight unseen because of that lunch or dinner or whatever it was with Marvin. I pointed my car across the country several months later. I had my little Honda Civic stuffed with all of my possessions. And I'm tootling across. I get to Iowa to a truck stop. I grab a phone, and I call Marvin. Just to let him know that, yes, I am in fact coming, a few more days since I'm in Iowa. And Marvin says, do you have a place to stay? And I said, well, I was just going to grab a hotel in Harvard Square and find an apartment. And he said, hang on for a second. And there's a little muffled noise, and he comes back. And he says, Gloria says it's okay if you stay in our attic. And I said, oh, all right. And so I arrived at 111 Ivy Street and unloaded my life into Marvin and Gloria's attic as if it was normal. As if it was just part of the deal. You go to MIT and this is what you do. You move in with your advisor. They didn't have that on the admission form. I hope that thought will sink in with a lot of you, because that was the sort of relationship that Marvin had with everyone. I was very struck, as a lot of his students were, by the way that Marvin's kids called their dad Marvin. They didn't call him Dad. And Marvin treated his children like they were his students, and his students like they were children. And it was, I still have to pinch myself. Two more little anecdotes. I guess one has to do with pollination, although that's not an adequate word. I had a meeting arranged with Marvin, graduate student advisor kind of thing. I showed up at his office, and there's no one there, which was kind of normal. So to kill time, I grabbed a book off the shelf, and I'm flipping through the front of the book, and there's a very lovely inscription from the author of the book. And it says, Marvin, do you remember that time we attended a conference in Hawaii at Kona? We took a walk on the beach to get away from all the boring speakers, and it was swarming with mosquitoes, and we were swatting the bugs. And he said, you know, I bet there are mosquitoes that have been frozen in amber that contain blood from extinct animals, like dinosaurs. And the author said, thanks for the idea. It worked out pretty well. It's Michael Crichton. And Gloria, if you're looking for the book, it was the second Jurassic Park novel, The Lost World. It's there somewhere. You know, is that pollination? I don't know. But when you know a lot about a little, you drop these little pearls, and they tend to have more resonance and be more disruptive than the typical pearl that people drop. The last little anecdote has to do with expecting the unexpected. Early on, when I was up in the attic, you know, late August, early September, no air conditioning, third floor, very hot. I couldn't sleep, and I noticed there was a bunch of graffiti scribbled on the wall, little things, little jottings signed Arthur C. Clarke or Danny Hillis or Claude Shannon, all the people who'd slept in the attic before me. I was hungry, and so I came downstairs to look for a midnight snack, and I opened the refrigerator, and it was full of stuff, just packed, all wrapped in brown butcher paper. And I opened up a packet, and it was sort of like meat, but there were sort of fingers in it, bones, and I thought, this is not for people. And I lost my appetite in a nanosecond, thinking Frankensteinish thoughts, and I went into the living room and sat down in the couch. Not that couch, that's a later version. It was a wider couch, the webbing had failed, you sort of sink in and lose a lot of stuff in the couch. So something crunched underneath me, and I pulled it up, and it was a draft of Marvin's Society of Mind. So I did what I often do with drafts. I skipped right to the end to see how this mind stuff all worked out, and found the appendix. The appendix was acknowledgments. They were, first thing that struck me was they were so beautifully written. Marvin wrote like a poet when he wanted to. Just wonderfully written acknowledgments. And the second thing that struck me was the long list of people that he thanked. Just like Gloria said, all the students, all the secretaries, his advisor, von Neumann, you know, his interactions with Shannon, all the names were there. It was breathtaking, and it was apparent right from that moment that Marvin really cherished ideas, and he cherished people who had ideas and brought them into reality. When I talked to Marvin the next day, I said, what the hell's in your refrigerator? And he said, oh, that's just seal blubber. And I said, oh, of course, you know, seal blubber. Why do you have a refrigerator full of seal blubber? And Marvin said, well, Susan Butcher keeps winning the Iditarod sled dog race. She lives here in Brookline, and she's got a whole dog team, and she needed a place to keep her seal blubber. Of course, because if somebody sends you a truckload of seal blubber, you call Minsky. And you know, that all speaks to expecting the unexpected. I have that one last picture, if you could put up. I just wanted to say one thing about it. That one. The people are all wonderful. This was our the last EG conference that Marvin was able to attend. He was always our lounge pianist. Little Joey Alexander is 11 years old. He's the next Mozart or Chopin. Unbelievable prodigy. Michael Wright reconstructed the Antikythera mechanism. Go Google that up and blow your mind. But the reason I put this picture in there is because I see I have my hand on Marvin's shoulder. And I just thought back to all the times that he put his hand on my shoulder when I was tapping away on a computer or playing on a piano, and the way he touched so many of us. So, thanks.
Hello, I'm Dylan Holmes. I'm a PhD student in artificial intelligence. And I first met Marvin when we started working together when I was his teaching assistant back in 2013. One of the things that really stood out about Marvin in his Society of Mind lectures was his muse-like character, because he would give these brilliant lectures scintillating with ideas that would make you think for months or years afterwards. But the amazing thing was, on top of all that, the way he would start his lectures, because he would almost invariably start by saying, "Does anyone have any questions?" Or, I guess in his more characteristic way, "Does anyone have any good ideas? Or maybe bad ones would be better." See, he was overflowing with ideas of his own, but he always cared what his students were thinking about, what problems they had, and what solutions they had found. And he had that knack of always misunderstanding a suggestion as an idea that was 10 times better than the one that you thought you were thinking of. For that reason, I always thought of Marvin as this muse-like character. So that was what lecture was like. Behind the scenes, about an hour or two before each lecture, I would meet with Marvin. We met not in his office, but always in his living room that you see around you. That living room was a cultural focal point, as has been mentioned before. There were all of these famous and intelligent and talented people from all around the world who would come to visit him. I saw famous mathematicians and musicians and science fiction writers, all of them. And then, of course, I had to go there and sit where they were sitting and talk to the man himself. Needless to say, it was a little intimidating at first. But you know, Marvin would always listen to people, and he'd always listen to everyone in exactly the same way. I like to think that the fact that he had so many famous and talented people in his living room was a testament to his intellectual horsepower and to the quality of his ideas. And the fact that he had so many other people there, people like me, people he had just met in his living room, was a testament to his open-mindedness and to his egalitarian spirit. I learned from talking with him that he'd entertain any idea just to see what it had to say. And in the same way, he'd entertain any person just to hear what they had to say. So there we were in his living room. We had many conversations there. One of the ones that stands out in particular is the one we had before the first day of Society of Mind. I said something like, "Marvin, I'm so excited. I can't wait to see what you have planned for this lecture. I can't believe it's 20 minutes before we're starting. What do you have planned?" And he said, "Oh, good, 20 minutes. What do you want to do in class?" You know, he was always improvisational like that. He never liked planning anything, and he was so spontaneous, it was almost as if planning would spoil the surprise. He was the kind of person who would much rather push a button or hop a fence or open a door and then figure it out from there, rather than plan it out in advance. And you know, I came to him in subsequent weeks with many suggestions for what we could do during lecture. I said we could have student panel discussions or debates, and he had suggestions of his own. Like, we could make all of the students into TAs, and then they could teach each other. And no matter what we came up with, and no matter what we decided, and no matter when we decided it, he would stroll into the lecture hall and knock it out of the park. I guess I found that inspiring because it was so fearless, because he cared much less about things going according to plan and much more about seeing what you could do in the moment and what you were capable of. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the same attributes that made Marvin such a creative and original thinker were the attributes that made him into such a kind person and such a fun person to be around and to talk to. See, he would give these lectures that were muse-like, and he was overflowing with his own ideas, but he would also listen to his students and hear theirs. He would have all the most famous and talented and brilliant people in his living room, but he'd invite anyone over just to hear what they had to say. And he was fearless and improvisational in lecture and in life. And so it's because of the many ways he changed the way that I think, and because of the many ideas that still drive my research today, but also because of his warmth and compassion and generosity that he earned my respect and admiration. I knew shortly after meeting Marvin that in so many senses of the phrase, I wanted to do what he did. I still do, and he still inspires me to this day and every day.
Hi, I'm Danny Hillis. I'm another student of Marvin's. I also lived in the house for a while. In fact, I lived right under the floor there in the living room. I lived in the basement for a long time, actually while Marvin was writing Society of Mind. And I'm going to say some things that, actually, first I have to tell a story about the house, which is I went back there a couple of years ago, and I had a little portable Geiger counter that I thought Marvin would like to see, and I brought it with me. And I walked in the house. I was walking around the house, and I walked down the stairway into the basement to see where I used to live, and the Geiger counter went off. And so I opened up a closet, and the closet was full of chemicals and optics and lenses and things like that. And so I was trying to figure out what was radioactive, and I put everything on the floor. And everything I moved out was not radioactive. And eventually, I had the closet empty, and the Geiger counter was still going off. And I saw this sort of a secret panel in the back of the closet. And I opened that up, and there was a human skeleton. And so I went upstairs, and Gloria was there. And I was like, Gloria, I don't know how to tell you this, but there's a skeleton in your closet. And she's like, oh, that's where we put the skeleton. So it was a wonderful house to live in, and it was wonderful again because of this. The other speakers had mentioned this, but it was such a center of people coming through to talk to Marvin because his intellect and his ability to talk on any subject and challenge people on any subjects. And it was, as Patrick Winston said, when you first met Marvin, it was intimidating. Because Marvin's way of engaging with someone was whatever they said, he basically took the opposite point of view and told them how, what if they believed it very strongly, he explained, the stronger they believed it, the more he thought it was a stupid idea. And that was a scary thing to watch until you sort of got that this was his way of playing with people. It was his way of stretching people and so on. So we all kind of hung out and watched it for a while. And at the 30th anniversary, I told the story, which I won't repeat, but basically about how I got to know Marvin by hanging out while he was building something until I finally found something that I could argue with him about, something that he actually made a mistake on, and I could engage with him. And then, that was the way I got to know him, and I hung out with him enough then so that eventually he assumed that I worked for him. And that process was one aspect of Marvin. And everybody's talked about his kind of playfulness and his sense of humor and so on. But there's another side to him which always forced you to go deeper to things. So if you were a student and you got into an argument, he would loan you a book. And that was his kind of way of doing a reading assignment. So he would loan you a book on dimension theory or Tinbergen or Leibniz or something like that. And you were kind of got the message that, hey, if you really want to have this argument, read this book first. And he encouraged his students to really learn mathematics and understand it. And he really would take the trouble to teach them. I remember when I was a freshman, I went, and there's this thing that all MIT students discover with wonder of the e to the pi I equals -1. And it kind of looks magic. It's this magical formula that seems to make no sense. And I remember going into Marvin's office and asking him about that. And he explained to me about complex planes, and he gave this geometric explanation that made sense to me. And I said, oh, okay, well, I understand it. He says, no, you don't. That's just one way. You now understand it just one way. You don't understand something until you understand it more than one way. And then he started all over again, and he explained it to me with Taylor series and summing Taylor series in a completely different way, and basically gave an hour lecture to me, a freshman, coming in with a question to get me to understand this idea from more than one side. And he had that kind of depth that was always pushed you to think harder. And that was the thing he did around him. And that was why all those people were coming to his house, because he made them think, and he made us all think. And he engaged with people in that kind of adversarial intellectual style, but he also had with him, he also was a very tender, kind person. And he took on this persona that sometimes he didn't like directly act that way. But I remember once when I was an undergraduate with him and his students, and I started going through, I don't even remember what the problem was, but I had some difficult problem in my personal life. And Marvin was sort of aware of it, but we didn't talk about it directly. But I was obviously pretty sad about it. And he came and somewhere he found a concave lens, a biconcave lens. And he just came over to me and he said, "Here, that's to make things look smaller." And many times like that, he would, sorry. When we were doing the 30th anniversary, and I hope many of you were there, you got to see Marvin in full form. There was one thing that struck me. There was a slide that got shown a couple of times. And do we have the slide of Marvin in the Dartmouth conference? It was actually mentioned by Daniela earlier. But it was this slide of the founders of AI, with Marvin there in the center, and there are Claude Shannon's over there, John McCarthy, Oliver Selfridge, Nat Chester, Ray Salmanoff. So it's really an amazing set of people. But what struck me when I saw that slide is that that Marvin made sure that his students met all of these people, and that they got to know them. And it's what the kinds of people that Mike Hawley was mentioning, and certainly not people that I would have normally met in life. In fact, if I look at the people, but the scientists, the science fiction writers, the musicians that have been important to me and shaped me, almost all of them were introduced to me by Marvin. And he was so generous in sort of bringing everybody together like that. No matter, again, it was that mixture of connecting people. And the interesting thing is he would connect you to people he violently disagreed with on subjects. So, for instance, Francis Crick and him had go back and forth about consciousness, and Marvin thought consciousness was one of these suitcase words that really didn't mean a lot, and Francis Crick thought it was something very precise that could be found in the brain. And the great thing about Marvin is he would bring you into that discussion, and you would get to see these two people argue back and forth about it. And in that argument, he would form the ideas better. And so you got to see Marvin would argue with his own ideas. He would treat his own idea, he would tear apart his own ideas in the same way. And if you look at the history of the field of AI, each generation of thought was kind of Marvin inspired. So Marvin started out making neural networks. He made the first SNARK neural network machine and training, and made the kind of basic reinforcement algorithms that are in deep learning today. And then he looked at that and he said, well, this has this limitations. He wrote a book with Seymour Papert explaining why you would have to have multiple levels in order for it to do anything powerful. And you would have to have very large numbers of neurons. And at those days, you couldn't do that. And so he kind of went on to the next thing. But pretty much explained the kinds of algorithms that today we use in deep learning. But then he went on and did the kind of work with, you saw him explaining Patrick Winston's Arch program, and that generation of AI, that kind of symbolic reasoning, that became the dominant way of AI, where it was a single sort of planning thing that was making decisions and had a single point of view. And that became the dominant thing. But then he challenged it himself with society of mind. And society of mind, I think, is the thing that is maybe really the most profound of Marvin's ideas. And I think we've gotten used to thinking about it so much that it's worth stepping back and realizing how profound a thought that was, because he took something that was so basic that we all understand and take for granted, like, I think, therefore I am. You know, that's, how can you question that? And Marvin said, basically, well, who's the I? Is there really an I there? And he got this other view of what goes on inside the head, that the I was just a kind of illusion. The I was a story that we tell ourselves. And so it's a little bit analogous to, imagine someone from a foreign country might say, well, the United States wants to invade Iraq. Now, anybody that's part of the United States knows the United States doesn't want anything. It's what happens is kind of an emergent behavior of all the various forces of lots of people with different goals. The United States doesn't have a goal. The United States isn't happy or unhappy. But we tell a story about it as if it's an entity. In the same sense, we tell that kind of story about each other. So if we say this person has a goal, or this person is happy, or that person is irritated, we're really telling a kind of rough composite story. And actually, they're both happy and sad. They both have the goal and they have the opposite goal. But their emergent behavior is something that we need to simplify to tell a story about. So we have models of other people that are simplified. In that same sense, we make models of ourselves that are simplified. And so we have this model of ourselves that we want something, that we're happy, but we're really not. And that's what Marvin said, is that we're actually something much more complicated than that. That's a kind of a over-simple story that we tell ourselves. And that way of thinking about things, I believe, will become the way that we start to think about ourselves. And it's completely different than the way that people used to think about the mind. And it also has in it something that I think is touched on in the program. I encourage you all to read that little draft from Marvin's essay, because as soon as you start thinking about who we are as being this kind of society of ideas, you realize that not all those ideas necessarily have to live in the brain, in this monkey. But some of those ideas can live out on a machine, extending our mind. Some of those ideas live in other people. And so the way we think, in fact, we think with other people. We think with our tools, with our machines. And so our mind becomes something bigger, and we become something bigger. And when Marvin wrote the piece in the menu about grief, he points out that when we lose somebody that we depend on to think, is part of our mind, it is part of how we think, then we're sad because we've lost a part of ourselves. And I think we all feel that way about Marvin. But thank you very much.